good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Go ahead and get started with our webinar. Today we're going to be talking about Chemwatch risk assessments and how easy we can make that for you. Before I get started, a little housekeeping. We do have a question and answer box. If you could put your question and answers in there. We'll try to answer those as we go along, and then we'll also send a follow-up email, and the email will discuss every question and answer. So if you don't get a question in, or we don't get to yours because we got a big crowd today, we will send that out to everybody along with a recording of the session and the PowerPoint we're delivering today. So myself, I'm Paul Benbow, and with me today is Tom Hassey. Augusta Brindley and Amy Pina will also be contributing to our event. One quick slide on Chemwatch. We were founded in 1989, so we've been in business 30 plus years. We are headquartered in Australia. We have about 5,000 global customers. 7 of the top Fortune 500 companies have our product. 7 of the top 20 Fortune 500, let me rephrase that. And most of our customers are where you would think would be typical for people that need to manage chemicals: oil and gas, automotive, mining, aerospace, government, hospitals, universities. We do have 3 offices in the US. So kind of a quick agenda before I hand the presentation over to Mr. Tom Hassey is, risk assessment overview. What is a risk assessment? 4-stage risk assessment framework. What data sources do we use to make compliant risk assessments? Then we'll do a demonstration showing a risk assessment and its reporting, and then how Chemwatch can help. So without further ado, let me hand this presentation over to Mr. Tom Hassey. Tom?
Thank you, Paul. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for coming to our webinar. So before we jump into doing risk assessments and the different, we'll say, building blocks of how to build one, let's talk about, starting off, the difference between hazard and risk. Sometimes they get interchanged in light conversation. So hazard, any source of potential damage, harm, or adverse health effects. Examples are, excuse me, exposure to benzene introduces the hazard of an adverse health effect like leukemia. Welding introduces the hazard of exposure to weld fumes. Hazards can also include objects in the workplace like machinery or dangerous chemicals. A risk is the probability that a person will be harmed or experience adverse health effects when exposed to a hazard. The factors that influence the degree of the risk include how much a person is exposed to in terms of a hazard, and that is dependent upon amount, time of use, and frequency of use. How is a person exposed? Inhalations, skin contact, and the severities are the effects under the specific conditions of exposure. Much as I just mentioned, its volatility, time, and frequency of use. So a risk assessment starts with a hazard ID and aims to determine appropriate ways to eliminate or control the hazard. So what is a risk assessment? It's a science-based process consisting of identifying the hazard, characterizing it, assessing the exposure of the worker to this hazard, identifying the type of risk, its characteristics, and identifying or determining appropriate controls. So the severity of hazard and its potential outcomes are considered along with the level, exposure, probability in terms of the type of task, and operating environment, volatility of the material, and temperature of the environment. Excuse me. So within a risk analysis, that's a decision-making process consisting of 3 activities: the risk assessment itself, that's the science, right? That's the framework, the management of the risk, and communication of the risks. So the risk management is the process of weighing policy alternatives. An example would be in automotive, which occurs is it's much more, let's say, cost-effective to identify all workplace tasks with a risk control level of 3. That is, forced ventilation is the proper or appropriate control to put in place to minimize the risk to the worker. And things like containment are really unacceptable because in automotive plants, they turn over models quite frequently, and digging a hole in the floor, as you would say, from a facilities point of view, to put it in a containment booth is not very convenient. So the weighing policy alternatives, an example would be they will minimize exposure of the worker by rotating in workers into these dangerous jobs. So they adjust the time and frequency of use to compensate. Risk communication is the interactive exchange information through the risk analysis process of all relative parties concerning the risk, its factors, perceptions, and includes a detailed explanation of the risk assessment findings and the basis of risk management decisions. So it occurs in 4 stages. You identify the severity in terms of the hazard ID, and then grouping, we'll get to that in a minute. And that data comes from the SDS. The probability, how much are you using? Time and frequency, the time of its airborne potential, the frequency of use, and the type of tasks. Then there's risk calculation that occurs, which I'll show in a minute, and then you put in controls in place from an engineering point of view and an administrative point of view for the storage and transport of the material. And then there's control documentation, for instance, on eyeglass wear, it might be an example, for the worker in terms of controls from the workplace safety point of view. And those are actually 2 separate risk assessments, as we'll see in a minute. Slide, please. So severity, you got to classify these hazards. So as we mentioned earlier, any source of potential damage or harm on something or someone. So this is a little busy, but let's just bear with me. This is a process, and I'm going to talk through it, that what you're doing is starting with the top section, there's a predefined hazard grouping that you come up with, that's calculated, we come up with, that's used to assign a band to the chemical. And the bands are in the lower right corner. Those are what we call control bands. And so the start of the process is the H codes, you map them into hazard groups. And these are depicting how dangerous it is to breathe in the substance. So you can see with those sets of H codes, you can come up with 5 hazard groups. The most severe being hazard group E, is in Edward. So, and I'll talk about in a minute, you see some icons there, the ILO, that's International Labor Organization. We use their control banding process to dictate what occurs in the workplace. And we calculate a hazard rating for that material from an ILO point of view by these hazard ratings, which are derived, as I just showed you, from the H codes themselves. So an example for this Phenotec 810 LS, it has a hazard rating of 4+. And that's because its worst case scenario is H350. So you look at it, we look at its worst case. And then for the UN hazard rating, and UN is the storage and transport risk assessment, we'll call it, that takes into consideration the DG rating and the packaging class for the material. And what we use is a lookup table, a UN lookup table. We connect a wiki to it and go out there and pull in that data based upon the material's DG class and PG group. That information is not added. That's part of the risk assessment data extraction that occurs. And I'll show you in a minute, it's on the next slide, but I don't want to jump to it yet, but a hazard rating of 3 is calculated from the DG class and the PG group of this material, in this case, benzene. So once we have these ratings, we use a 5x5 matrix to identify where this material, what type of control needs to be used. So the horizontal axis is the GHS hazard rating. Vertical is the risk of exposure, which is calculated from parameters, as I mentioned earlier, volatility, temperature, amount, and frequency of use. And we'll highlight that in a minute. The GHS hazard rating is from its GHS classification. And I can't see the lower, well, I can't see the last line. My screen's not letting me, but what it says is the risk of exposure is due to the calculation of the probable exposure from its temperature, amount, and frequency of use, which is better demonstrated in a minute. So the idea is you can apply workplace controls, lower right corner, directly from the SDS hazard classification data, which you're not adding to the system. You're clicking on a chemical in our system, and this is extracted. And I'll show you in a minute. Next slide, please. So this is how we calculate the UN hazard rating, this lookup table. All the action, so to speak, happens in the upper right corner of the flow chart. So a DG value and a packaging value are pulled, let's say, from the SDS data, and then we use a wiki to connect to the UN lookup table and pull that data in. So you can see for that substance we just talked about, its DG rating about almost halfway down. It's a 3, as you can see. And then as you move over, its package rating's 2, so its hazard rating, UN hazard rating for risk assessment is a 3, group C. Slide, please. Again, this is all happening behind the scenes. You're basically manipulating the risk exposure calculations in terms of temperature, volatility, amount, and scale of use. Everything else we're pulling from the system. We're using our calculations to do some of this, but as I'll show in the demo, you can set your own calculations. For instance, I was approached by a R&D group within one of our military arms about they need to do risk assessments on new materials. And they've done some design experiments behind the scenes, so to speak, no details given, understandably, and they wanted to be able to set their own calculations. So you can do that. So stage 2, we talked about the severity. Oh, Paul, can you go back, please? So stage 2, this is probability of exposure. So we did severity, now probability of exposure, scale, frequency. Higher the scale of use, the higher the likelihood of exposure. The higher the frequency, the more likely of an exposure. Next slide, please. Thanks. So for probability of exposure, scale of use determined by the quantity handled in any particular risk assessment scenario. Again, the higher the use, the higher the exposure. Fairly straightforward relationship. Slide, please. The tasks. So certain tasks imply certain controls are needed. We mentioned welding, spraying. These come to mind off the top quickly, which will introduce probably the highest probability exposures from these types of tasks. So, and it also helps because the task is flagged in the risk assessment report for users at any point in time to print out or download or send this report, which is timestamped. And it will show that for this task, this is what the risk effect of the worker is based on these control parameters in place. Again, better shown here in a few minutes than spoken. Next slide, please, Paul. So calculations. Stole my story there. So you can see the hazard rating. And again, we calculate that from an ILO perspective using the H codes. And from a UN or storage and transport perspective, we calculate that hazard rating from the the DG rating and the packaging rating. And what you're able to control is the temp, volatility, scale, frequency of use. And again, based on these parameters, it's saying you need a risk band of 2, which is just general ventilation, maybe a fan. But as you adjust these, you will get a higher or lower rating depending on how you increase or decrease the exposure, as well as volatility. Obviously, it depends on the substance. And again, we define volatility as, let's say it's a solid, it's in state, and if in terms of low, and then high, it's a dust, right? And then liquid, we'll call it in state, if that's the right term. And then high volatility, it's a vapor. And as I mentioned earlier, the horizontal, the minimal, extreme, high, low, minimum, I got a frog in my throat. That's from the GHS classification. And then the severity is from those how you set these parameters up here. Okay. And again, you can actually control these. These are our calculations, but thank you, Paul. You can control this relationships by changing our risk of management calculations. Thanks, Paul. Next slide. So controls, they occur because we're doing two separate risk assessments, you're going to have two separate types of controls. For health or International Labor Organization, the chemicals assessed based on the nature of the hazard. And ILLs come up, as you saw earlier, with a risk assessment model described as control banding. It's based on, developed in the UK, known as COSHH Essentials, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And then on the UN side, we're using, as you saw, the DG and packaging ratings. And again, these are managed to develop to regulate, let's say, transport and storage of chemicals on land. And then on air, we have these other parameters, and you will be able to set these as part of the controls in place. Sorry, to be able to set these controls that you need in place to minimize this hazard. If I may give an example, in facilities, it will talk about separation of chemicals or wall thickness. And we're recommending these based upon the chemical that you're doing the risk assessment on. And as you'll see, the controls, when they come up, you're basically forced to accept them all to let's say, validate that the risk effect in terms of storage and transport, let's say if it's a 2, you got to accept all these engineering and admin controls to make that happen. If you don't, it violates, let's say, the premise that it is a 2, and it would probably have to be rated higher. Better shown than spoken. Next slide, please, Mo. So what we put in place of controls on the worker exposure end are documents, like recommendations on ventilation, the booth, this type of information. And you can also add your own. So our documents typically will, and again, these are industry standards we're putting in there, address things like skin, environment, safety, general maintenance. We'll see these in a minute, but you can also add your own. If you have some internal documentation, say, for instance, internal engineering standards on the UN side. I work for one of the large automotive manufacturers and facilities group, so we have our own standards and how you can store things. So you would pull in those facility standards as part of your documentation. And here we are. So for storage and transport, you'll get, again, a pull down. For instance, how the control of ignition sources. There has to be a separation, let's say, in certain materials. You can't have an ignition source like a compressor nearby. And you'll have to accept, like the firewalls, you see the vapor barriers, the electrical installations. A user will have to accept all these in order for the risk control recommended to be, I don't know if you want to call it executed, but to be validated. These documents can be printed out and they're attached to the actual, you can attach them to the PDF of the risk assessment report that's created when we run one of these. So the risk assessment report, this is a communication tool. What this does is bind, and it has signature boxes that you can add. It doesn't show it here, but I'll show it in the demo. It has signature boxes that you can obviously add that identify specifically processes, or let's say standards, engineering standards that have to be adhered to, how many people are going to be assigned. There'll be names and signature boxes where people have to sign off on this. So this basically is, in an ILL or a worker safety point of view, a document that defines the workplace as to how he or she will use the chemical. So just looking at it real quick, you can see it has 8R OELs. It also talks about the hazard rating, right? This is GHS we talked about, and the risk effect to the worker is very high. And so this is defining that you have certain controls in place that, let's say, minimize this risk effect of the worker. This is actually unusual for it to go up. Typically with controls in place, you'll knock this down. I don't know the chemical off the top of my head, but it all has to do with the risk of exposure, why that's going up so high. And I have a feeling that even though the materials are 3, and I can't see it here because they didn't have a signature box in this one, but in the signature box, you will have in there the controls, specifically, for instance, time of exposure. I have a feeling that this material, the worker is exposed at long periods of time to it. And as the PPE, as we all know and love in blue, but these little red ones here, these are Chemwatch recommended icons. And what's saying here is actually two groups of people. Worker, if you read this, that means make sure you have an open window when you do the job. Facilities, make sure you put this workstation near a window. Won't do you any good in the middle of the plant. And then the emergency, what we're saying is you need to use foam here, if God forbids that happens. The hazard ratings we talked about from the GHS code, or from the H codes. Hazard statements, people at risk, and these are things you're adding. And then other icons, and I'm having a little difficulty reading them, but again, all about worker safety. This is a document you can put in the workplace, or however the buy-off occurs between, in this case, facilities and process, might even be the union. And again, you have all these sign-off boxes where you can capture this information, and this becomes basically a source of truth for how the chemical needs to be used in the workplace and to keep your workers safe. So the report, easy to understand. You can see the statements and the wording is very short and succinct. We always put these on one page. You can add user text to these reports. It's a development on our side within the software. It can be a few $100. The most I saw was maybe $1,500 to add that. And then there would be, during the actual risk assessment, before the report's created, the user would be able, through a form, be able to add text to this. Expertise should not be required to understand the content of the report. This is really all about GHS's goal, HASCOM 2012, goal about right to understand, right? This combines the H codes and the environment and the material all in one page as to how am I going to use this. By the way, as a facilities engineer, this thing is fabulous. I wasn't working in that space when this was available, and these would have to be basically glommed together from different information silos and get buy-off in a meeting room if you want, on how you're going to go about doing this. So we addressed this lack expertise not being needed, as you saw with the color coding, simplified phrases and icons and images wherever possible. This is actually outdated. This is actually 31 years. So this is our information. The layout of the report is from customer input. How do you want this to look? How do you want it to work? And the information that we're pulling into this report and actually into the risk assessment itself, where the data shows up in this report, we're pulling it from both the vendor document. We extract about 70 plus data points from each vendor document. And these are active data points. That is, next to the vendor PDF in our database, there's actually an active 70 plus database where those data points are being updated by us free of charge through our web crawling machine. And then we have a document called a Chemwatch Gold SDS. I'll talk about these in a minute, but quickly, the history on a gold. A number of years ago, a global pharmaceutical giant came to us and asked us to create a review SDS from an independent point of view, that is, from a point of view of someone who's not selling a product or chemical, to come up with an independent analysis on the chemical. That is, create a lookalike SDS, if you want to call it that. That is a 16-section SDS, much like the vendor, except it's neutral. They were having a very difficult time with about 5 suppliers who every one of them, in terms of supplying the same material, had a variance of over 50% on how something was being classified. And these are all toxins, or a toxin's a toxin, right? It gets rated a certain way. But there's too much variance, and they were having a hard time differentiating. Next slide, Paul. So before we get there, the risk assessment itself in our system, you can embed this in different other processes, one of them being approvals. So what this means is the risk assessment is actually one of the steps, if you want to call it, within a stage for accept or reject. So for instance, bear with me, with our software, you can set up multi-stage approvals. So the first stage might be materials engineer requests a new material. They have a number of criteria they need to define, like location, how much they need, why do they need that. As it's pushed up to the next level, let's say EH&S at some point, maybe it's safety, one of the things a lot of our clients will do is for this person's accept or reject, one of the criterions might be, or is typically, hey, you need to run a risk assessment on this substance in terms of how you're going to use it in the workplace. Much like we just saw earlier, there's a number of settings and controls that can be done, a report's created, and then the report's attached to this this stakeholder's documentation that he or she will now push forward to the next stage for accept or reject. And then there's notifications can be received within the approvals in terms of, say, the risk assessment being accepted or rejected or even completed. And then there's current pass requests. These are actually a number of items within the approvals workflow module itself. And I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that since this is a risk assessment. We'll do approvals webinar here in the next few months. So, excuse me. Paul, next slide, please. Thank you. So risk assessment data sources. We have over 60 million vendor SDS in our database. And these risk assessments, as I mentioned earlier, get pre-populated with either vendor data or the Chemwatch Gold data. When I do my demo, I have my system, so when I bring up a risk assessment, the chemical automatically defaults to the gold data. But I'll show you, you can pick a vendor, and if we have done what we call the vendor extraction, what we call VGD, which I'll show in a minute, if that vendor document has that data available, you can run the risk assessment on the vendor data. So some of the data points pulled: ingredients, proportions, cast numbers, physical properties, molecular weight, vapor pressure, classifications, pictogram, any precautionary statements. And we extract this automatically as part of our update process in managing your chemicals, which is free of charge. But you can actually add information to the risk assessment itself. So for instance, you pick a vendor document where we don't have a lot of data on it, we don't have VGD, which means we maybe have 20, 30 data points pulled. You may have to add some information to run an effective risk assessment. So you're able to do that through a dialog box. Next slide, Paul, please. So, gold data. I'll talk about the vendor in a minute, but with the gold data, just quickly, within a customer's database, folders can be set up where chemicals are pulled into these folders, and these emulate your physical locations. So warehouse 5 would have, 20 chemicals in there, and what they are the SDS itself. When you pull these in, it is issue date, talks about the risk codes and cast number and the vendor. But that VGD icon, that means the 70 plus data points have been pulled. But if it has the gold icon, what it means is in a separate data set. They're next to each other, but they're separate. You can pull data from either one, your choice, is our Chemwatch Gold SDS. So for instance, in our database, we have almost 4,500 vendor toluenes, but we only have one gold toluene. And this comes into our customer's database or folder structure automatically. So for instance, customer XYZ has benzene sigma aldrich in their collection. They become a customer. When we do migration, the gold document comes with it. That's a material review STS, much as I talked about earlier, 300 data points. Real-time links, we actually link ingredients into our regulatory list library of over 7,000 lists. So Prop 65 carcinogen affects 100 cast numbers. We do that linking for you. It's available in 93 country formats. And I mentioned earlier, focuses on worker safety, hazard communications, and you can create one-page worker safety sheets, 47 languages. Next one, Paul. Paul, I think you're missing a few slides. I think you missed the vendor data one.
I'm just clicking them, Tom.
All right. Okay. Something missing here, folks. Anyway, this is what it looks like when you get started. And I was going to show you the vendor data. It's just a table. We'll include it in the slides. That shows the 70 data points we're pulling. And I mentioned all the physical components, ingredients, etc. What is occurring here, what you're seeing is this is actually the screen in the system after you've clicked on a folder when you're in the risk assessment module. So you get these worker, these operating tools pop up automatically. It's 5 steps. You add a material. Actually, you just click on a folder and you select a material. You pick a task. You do your risk assessment. You add your control documents. You print out your report. Pretty straightforward. So this is
Okay, Tom.
time for a
So
demo.
Gusty is ready to do the demo. So let me hand the control to Gusty.
And Augusta is our product specialist for this tool.
Gusty, you should have a dialog box now. I can see your screen.
Hi, everyone. Nice to have you with us today. Thank you, Tom, for explaining that. I am going to go ahead and go into the demo portion of today's webinar. You should be able to see my screen. I am showing our database. As Tom mentioned, our system does a host of different things, one being SDS management. So that's our core product, and that's what you see here. In addition to that, we have the module called risk assessment. So you will see that that works in conjunction with our SDS module, which is what I'm showing on the screen now. And you'll see that I could be working in a folder and viewing the SDSs and jump over to risk assessment, and it will actually open me into that same folder that I was already in. So this risk assessment module mirrors our home module in the sense that it mirrors all of the locations that you have set up, and this can be set up however you would like. This is typically based on location, but different organizations decide to define these in different ways. And of course, that is based on goals and objectives. Now, in this particular demo, you will see that I have this sectioned out based on location. When you click a location, it will show you the contents of that folder. Now, again, this is linked to SDS data. And as Tom mentioned, you will have all of those individual products listed in this risk assessment view, as well as the SDS itself. So that vendor SDS that you decided to store, and all of the data that comes with it. So just as a reminder, we don't just manage PDFs here at Chemwatch, we actually manage actual data. So just to remind you what Tom already mentioned, as a part of that data, we have VGD data, which is vendor generated data, and that is extracted directly off of the vendor SDS. And we also have that gold data, which is independently researched and written by Chemwatch. And those are two data sets that you can work with. Now, what is the value of that data? Now, in terms of value with risk assessment, we can actually use that data in a variety of ways in order to not only assess the original hazard rating of that substance based on the SDS itself, but we can also determine the actual risk based on the environment and manner in which your workers use it. So you'll see here, I have a substance that's stored in my library. And of course, there could be, vendor data or gold data associated with it. Regardless, your system will be set up to use one of those data sets to derive an original hazard rating. And of course, that original hazard rating, as I already mentioned, is derived directly from those H codes. Now we have those H codes, so we're actually able to use that in order to drive a calculation along with certain inputs in order to develop that risk band. So again, we have two different risk band calculations that you can perform. One of those being for dangerous goods. So this is for transport and storage, or we have a health risk assessment. So this is based on the ILO model. And this is the only risk assessment model that has been refined for risk assessment with chemicals. So in order to conduct this risk assessment, you simply need to just perform a couple of steps. You need to unlock that material. Essentially, that's going to signal to the system that you need to edit this. Then you can assign it a task. So all of these chemicals are used for different things and different tasks. We do have some preset tasks here in the system, and you can use any of these 15. If I click on these, you'll see that it will expand more options, and you can simply select that, and that will be reported against this item. So you'll see that that appears under the name, and it will also appear in your final report. So once you have selected a task, you again can toggle that on or off. Or if you have unique tasks within your organization, we also have the ability to define new tasks. So you can create any new task with the name that you would like in the system. Once you have selected or defined the task, then you simply need to move into these columns here, which include operating temperature, volatility and dustiness, scale of use, and frequency of use. And then finally, we'll talk about different controls that you can apply. Firstly, we will go ahead and apply an operating temperature. You will see that the state of the material will already be defined based on the information either on the Vendor SDS or from the Gold SDS, and that would be based on your master system settings. So again, you can choose either of those as your primary set. Then you can go in here and toggle this using your mouse, or you can simply type it in to this field, and then the system will register that against the chemical. Now, the volatility and dustiness sometimes is set for that particular chemical, or you can adjust it. So in this case, you might want to adjust it based on the state that it's used in your organization. And of course, that could have an impact on the actual risk band itself. Now, it is important to note that for this chemical, we were talking about the hazard ratings earlier. Now, the reason I selected this one for the demo is because we actually rank these from 0 to 4+, 0 being non-hazardous and 4+ being extremely hazardous. So this is an extremely hazardous substance, regardless of, how it's used. But once we take into account how it's used, you'll see that that will actually have a bearing on the risk band itself. So say that we're going to be using this in very small amounts, maybe monthly, and you'll notice that according to the H codes on the SDS itself, it was extremely hazardous. But based on how we're using it, it's actually been reduced to moderately hazardous based on the risk itself. So you'll see that it's actually performing those calculations in real time in order to deduce that value. Likewise, we can also further apply controls by toggling on this control button, and you'll see that some options will appear with regards to applied controls. Again, we're ranking this according to the severity of that chemical. And in this case, it is going to suggest an applied control of local exhaust or fume hood. So if I were to apply that local exhaust or fume hood, and again, it's highlighting it in green, you'll see that it will reduce that risk to 1, because not only are we using it in a low frequency, but we also have applied controls in the area as well. Now, if you apply the minimum recommendation, which is in green, you'll see that it will reduce that risk band, or anything above that will also reduce it. If you were to apply anything below the minimum recommendation, it will log it in your report. However, it will have no bearing on the risk band itself. So in this case, we'll go ahead and accept the minimum recommendation by the system because we actually have a fume hood in that area, and we will be working with this material under that fume hood. Now, we will say that training is required because, again, this is an extremely hazardous chemical, but if it is used properly and the appropriate controls are taken into account, then of course we can significantly reduce that risk. You can also review the PPE for this substance. You will see that we will have recommendations based on the system, and those will be noted by this little box. However, you can adjust these however you see fit using your judgment and expertise. Once you are finished applying those, you simply need to press submit, and then those controls and those PPEs will be applied. We can also add phrasing to our document as well. So you will see that the system will produce phrasing for you. You simply need to review this and decide what you would like to include in your final report based on, again, the environment and manner in which it's used, and then apply those and then exit out of that. Additionally, you can also apply whether this is discharged by air, water, or land. Once you are finished with those entries, then you simply just need to lock your risk assessment, and then it will ask you if your risk assessment is completed, and it will also ask you if you would like to copy this over to the other modes. So as I've mentioned, we have two different modes. One is for a health risk assessment, which we're conducting now, and another is for transport and storage. So if we would like to copy these inputs over to that other mode for the same material, we can have the system do that now. And that will just save us time once we're conducting the risk assessment for transport and storage. Now, once that is finished, you will see a full report is going to be produced in the background. And this full report is going to be ready for you to view. Now, I was working with another German client, so you'll see that my system was actually set to German, and that's a good point. This can actually be translated in 47 different languages, but in this case, we'll just view this document in English. So you'll see in the background, our system has produced a report for this substance, and this is a health risk assessment report. It will note the original hazard rating based on the H code strictly, and then the risk band based on all of the inputs that we have selected or adopted. So you will see those adopted controls, the ingredients, the CAS numbers, any relative OELs. Likewise, the Chemwatch hazard rating. So again, we rank these based on flammability, body contact, reactivity, toxicity, I can't talk today, and chronic effects. And it will give you an indication of what is triggering it to be hazardous. Likewise, it will outline personal protective equipment, health hazards, and then any precautionary statements and hazard statements, and also those phrases that you elected to add to your risk assessment. You can print, share this by email, or download this locally to your computer. Now that is an example of our health risk assessment, but we also have another type of risk assessment where you can perform this in our alternative mode. So you will see that we were conducting risk assessments on these materials, and anytime you see that there is a status for a material, it is going to indicate that something has changed about that material. So you will see for those that have a completed risk assessment, they will have this green checkbox. So for that one that we just completed in ILO, you will see that there is a green checkbox. Likewise, for anything where we have copied information to another mode, you will see a question mark. So that will say that it is partially completed, but not wholly completed. Likewise, we also have ways to tell whether an assessment has not been completed or whether it needs to be reviewed. So again, a lot of this data is driven off of the SDS itself. So if that SDS is out of date by either 3 to 5 years, administrators set that in the settings, then it will trigger a review. Likewise, you can also say an assessment is not required. So for this one, I can see that it's not hazardous based on H code, so I can simply apply a status of not hazardous. Now for the one that we just conducted that I can see is partially done, so I could do it either on either of these, it doesn't really matter. It was this one that we were working on earlier. You'll see that I can simply unlock it, and all of the information that I transferred over will still be here, but you will see that based on transport and storage, an assessment is not required. So it is actually not hazardous in that respect. However, you can go in here and conduct those for any substances that do require a risk assessment. So again, the controls will be different for different substances. So this is a good example. If I unlock this, you'll see that the controls are going to be slightly different in this view. So you will see that it's going to ask you information like, have you considered flammability, any explosion hazards? Likewise, have you performed a compliance check? What date did you perform that on? When should you review it? have you reviewed the controls with regards to personal protective equipment, waste, and first aid? You'll see that we have auxiliary controls, engineering controls, and administrative controls. And of course, you can review these all independently and decide what you would like to include in your final report. You can re-review the PPE, but of course, it's going to carry it over from your original risk assessment in the health risk assessment mode if you elect to do so. And then you can link any standards. Now, we do have some standards already pre-linked here, but of course you can browse your own library and link these as you see fit. Now, once you're finished applying your controls, again, you can add checklist information and discharge information, but ultimately you will lock the report and it will produce this report in the background for you. So this is going to look very similar to the health risk assessment report, but it is going to be for transport and storage. So again, you'll see that it's a dangerous goods risk assessment report, and you'll see that we have conducted this for this particular chemical. So that is an introduction to our risk assessment tool. I know that we're a little bit tight on time, but there are many other features to this tool that I would be happy to show you at a later time. If you are interested, please connect with one of our sales representatives and we can show you a full demo of all of the features within this module.
That was great, Gusty. Yeah, if you could pass it back to me, that'd be great. I've got a very brief presentation on our mobile app, and then we'll wind this webinar up.
Okay.
Okay, where's my screen that I click on? You are the host now. Okay. And hopefully you can see my screen. So I'm going to show you basically how to do risk assessments via our mobile app. And so on our mobile app, it's very simple. You know, all of the abilities, capabilities, features that Gusty was presenting, a lot of those have been removed from the mobile app just to make it very quick. So it's very easy, like most things on a smartphone, you just touch, you know, Cobra. And then here I can look at all my chemicals in this view, where I can see all of my chemicals, or I can use the same folder structure. So this may be your company, etc. So if I click on folders, then I've got demo company, location 1. So it's just like you would expect on any mobile device. On this, I'm in the storage area, and I've got this one chemical I was playing with. And if I unlock that from the bottom of the screen, you'll notice the hazards are 3 and a risk is a 2. And if I increase my temperature, you know, I can see that as I get hotter, or I increase the volatility or the frequency of use, you know, my risk actually increases. So if I go to daily, monthly, or if I change the amount that I'm working with, that will also change my risk factor. So from the mobile device, it allows you to do very simple risk assessment. So if you're out in the field, you see an activity and you're like, oh my gosh, I want to capture that real quick. You can do that with the mobile phone. And if you think about it, because all our software is running in the cloud, really the mobile device is just working the functionality that's on our servers. When you do it on the desktop machine, you get a lot more features that you can work with. But on the mobile app, you get just enough to kind of get the job done. Now we do have the ability to add tasks, so you can click on the tasks button, very similar to what Gusty was able to present to you. I was on the phone as well. And I also have the ability to do controls. So controls, if I have containment or local exhaust, then those also will affect my risk. So if I go into controls and say containment and close, you'll see my risk went down. So when I lock this risk assessment back up, and I'll say I do want to save that. And then I also have the ability to run a report, so I can click on my report, and it will run the same kind of report that you saw Gusty produce. But like I said, for a very comprehensive risk assessment, definitely use the app that's available in your desktop machine. But for when in the field, if you need to do a risk assessment, you're out in the field, you have your phone, it is possible via our mobile app to do this. So my phone connection is not nearly as good as Gusty's. She's probably got some kind of high-speed internet at her house. But if I simply were to zoom into this, you can see very quickly that I can move around in this document. And it's the same exact document that was created by our desktop app. It has the color coded for the highest hazard rating, the risk and the hazard, PPE, all that kind of information. I also can share this so via all of the things you would expect a phone to do. So I can send that text message, Gmail, all that kind of thing. So it's possible to take this information, share it immediately. So if you were out in the field, you saw a worker doing something, you could do a risk assessment while you're standing there and actually send that to anybody that would need that. So, so that being said, let me go ahead and just finish up the PowerPoint. I did want to show you that very quickly because it is a capability we have. And let me go back to our slideshow. And because we're running low on time, whoops, wrong button. Because we're running short on time, I'm just going to kind of pop through our slides very quickly because I do want to be sensitive that we're running low on time. So, you know, one thing that makes Chemwatch great is our data. You know, we have over 60 million vendor SDSs. We have an integrated chemical regulatory database. And we have a really big 250,000 classified substances in our classification database. We do offer, you know, authoring solutions as well as chemical management. So the classification database is very helpful in that. Expertise, you know, we see chemical management as managing chemicals, not just PDFs. And because we author 3,000 to 5,000 SDSs a month, the company actually got its start authoring SDSs. So the owner, founder, CEO of the company is a PhD toxicologist and has been, this company is his vision for 30 years. So he's always been very careful to maintain what these chemicals are, as opposed to you know, a startup that just saw this as a way to manage PDFs. So that being said, a lot of our employees are chemists, hygienists, toxologists, regulatory experts, physicians. So the Chemwatch staff is, you know, uniquely structured. And lastly, our platform, you know, everything is plug and play. Everything is written in .NET. Everything is cloud-based. We do use Amazon Web Services. Software as a service application. Your IT department is going to love us because there's very, you know, other than getting the single sign-on set up, everything else is ready to go. And we do have a API, so we can integrate with whatever system you may have currently. We do offer 47 language and 93 country format support, so we can work with you. Because we are based in Australia, we are very good at Pacific Rim, we're very good at European, and we're very good at US English. So we offer global coverage for your needs. Some of these slides, I'm going to send you this slide deck because we're kind of running short on time. I'll kind of pop through these very quickly. But, you know, one bread and butter thing we do is just keeping your vendor SDSs current. This slide gets into all the detail of how we find the SDSs and we bring them into our database and we bless them with a scientist. And then once they're in the database, we can take that information and export it into labels, worker safety sheets, push that into ERP. And actually risk assessment is just a use of this data. So if I had one more little box in that bottom row, it could be risk assessments. So we update all the SDSs in your location. So all this kind of happens free of charge. And all of this is monitored by an app we call the Chemwatcher. So in VGD, what we call vendor generated data, GHS allowed us to actually capture, because every SDS had to be homogeneous. So we know that there's 67 data points usually on a vendor SDS that we can capture. And then we can take that data and we put it into our database, and then we use that information to feed things like a risk assessment or like a secondary labeling. So we can do ingredients reporting like SARA, because we kind of know what makes that chemical tick. We also map that ingredient all the way through to our database. So if WD-40 has, you know, an ingredient in there, then we might take that sub ingredient and actually map that through to our database to let you know. So if that ingredient is on maybe Prop 65, then we would tell you, yes, an ingredient in WD-40 is on Prop 65, and we could alert you to that. We do use idle time on the Amazon Web Servers to help us find SDSs. So we actually harvest about 1 million SDSs every week. Then we use artificial intelligence technology to find duplicates if we already have it. We discard it if we don't. Then we try to acquire that So the goal of this is to make your job of finding SDSs easier. When we find an SDS, we actually present you with a side-by-side of old versus new. We highlight the changes in red, so trying to make it easier for you to understand what's changed from an old SDS to a new SDS. And then you'll be allowed to say, I want to keep the new SDS as my document of record. We will in turn archive the old one and we'll never throw it away. Another powerful feature is our ingredients. We actually have a regulatory management system via our regulatory database, and then we keep track of regulatory changes, and then we can tell you that. And our regulatory report would tell you this chemical was added to Prop 65, and you have that because maybe, as an earlier example, it's in WD-40. So we would actually tell you, which products contain those ingredients and where you have that stored. Moving right along, we have a new feature, heat mapping. So we can actually take your facilities models, overlay your chemicals and the amount of your chemicals, and then run that through our algorithm and come up with the danger, much like we do in a risk assessment. And then we can color code these for the highest hazard rating and hotspots and actually tell you where you have chemicals of concern or areas of concern, so that anybody, administrator, somebody that's way up in management that doesn't understand the risks or where your dangerous chemicals are, they can look at a floor plan and actually see color coded, where the dangerous chemicals are located. And this might be very handy for emergency response people. We do take into account sprinklers, so there's a lot of technology that went into this application, containment, firewalls, sprinklers, things like that. So it's a really, really well done system. We do have an SAP interface now for S/4HANA. So if you're an SAP user, Chemwatch does have a SAP interface we've just introduced. Like I said, we have a mobile app. I didn't show some of the other parts of the mobile app, but basically it's the same idea. You click on the folder, you click on the document. It presents you with an SDS. You can zoom in. Once you zoomed in, you can, share that with somebody else. You can do chemical lookup by name, or you can do a risk assessment like I showed. And like I said, here again, we can share that information quite easily via the standard things you would expect on any phone. We do have the ability to do an offline archive. So you can take all your chemicals and say, I want to put those on a thumb drive, or I want to put them on a phone that may not have cell coverage. So you say, well, we're going into a spot where we're not going to have internet on the phone. You can actually download this to a phone and actually have access to your documents without connectivity to the internet. Now those documents will become static at that time because we're downloading them, but the next time you come back into coverage, you could just rerun it and refresh that data. So that being said, I kind of got a little fast through there, but I wanted to finish on time. Let me open it up. Tom, I guess we have a few minutes. If you would like to leave, we understand. And we will be sending the question and answer out to everybody, but let's just go a few extra minutes and take care of some question and answer, and then we'll wrap it up. Sound good? So Tom, do we have any question and answers out there?
Yeah, we have a number of them. Some of these are going to have to be answered, offline, but early on, there was a discussion on dangerous versus hazardous chemicals. So let's be clear, hazardous, we'll say substances, are classified by their immediate or long-term health effects. And dangerous substances are classified by their immediate physical effects, like fire, explosion, poisoning. Let's see. Oh, a question. How can it be modified by, how can you modify the job name? When you create a risk assessment report, a dialog box will pop up where you can add job names, signature boxes, change the risk assessment, the next date, we'll call it, add names, add processes, entirely up to you, totally customizable in that respect. And see, the others are rather deep, and quite frankly, I need to consult some of our scientists on it regarding volatility and dustiness. And someone asked, how can risk be determined for a chemical preparation, a mixture of several substances where its exact composition is not known? Well, I know our authoring tool for ingredients, you don't need specific amounts. You just need a range. Like you don't need to know benzene down to the exact milliliters. You could say, well, it's 20 to 30% of this mixture.
If we had
Gusty,
an extra 10 minutes, we could show that because we knocked that one out of the park.
and
'Cause you
Gusty,
get- yeah.
Gusty, are you there? Do you know if how the risk assessment behaves in the same way that is from the vendor data? Can it handle, let's say, a percentage? You can run. Oh, there we go.
I am here. I would like to defer to our experts on that question, just
Sounds
to
good.
verify the answer. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We do have pre-classification, as Paul mentioned, of about 250,000 substances, but let us get back to you to be very clear on just how we handle mixtures from a risk assessment point of view. We do have a tool that comes free of charge with our SDS management platform called Credo, where you can make labels, you can actually create the worker safety documents like the mini from a mixture without it being an official SDS. In other words, it does do GHS classification. You can convert it to 47 languages. So we have that available for classifying mixtures. Paul, I think we ran out of time.
I was going to say that kind of segues me perfectly into our next webinar because I was having ideas in my head that in the future we could show that capability in a webinar of how we can do exactly that, showing our Credo capability for both secondary labeling, safety cards, as well as risk assessment. So let's kick that around. I like that idea. Maybe in the early summer. But moving right along, our next webinar is February 23rd, and we're going to talk about H codes and how we can use H codes to drive your chemical management process, and that'll be on February 23rd. So that being said, you'll get an email from us with the link to the recording, the slide deck, and the question and answers answered fully. And that being said, I guess we're going to dismiss everybody. Ran a few minutes late, but I hope you all have a good day, and thank you again for joining us.